This video is sponsored by Sharesight. I use Sharesight to accurately calculate my portfolio performance, and I also use it to calculate my tax obligations really simply. So if you're interested in getting 4 months free when you purchase an annual subscription with Sharesight, head to the link sharesight.com/investingwithtom. Hey guys, Tom here from the Investing with Tom YouTube channel. Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoyed today's video, hit like, hit subscribe, and that way you can see future videos as well. So I recently sat down and I wrote an article for Hatch. I've been doing this for the last couple of months, and this article was on my top 5 tips to become a wise investor. Simple, easy tips that are really practical and that basically any investor can go out and utilize. And I thought it would be useful to actually share some of these tips on the channel. I don't get extra money for you guys clicking on the link from this video or anything like that. I just really thought it would be useful to share. A lot of these tips probably don't deserve their own full 15-minute YouTube video or anything like that. So I thought I'd pack all 5 of these into one. But if you're interested in checking out the full article, I'll leave the link down in the description. But for now, let's get straight into them. These are my top 5 tips that basically anyone can utilize on how to improve your investments, become a wiser investor, and hopefully make better returns over the long term. So I hope you enjoy. So my first tip is kind of a boring one, frankly, but definitely very valuable, and I think a lot of people could benefit from this. And this is basically going down the path of index investing. Now, if you don't know what index investing is, you might have heard it called something like ETF investing. Basically, it's all about, rather than picking individual companies, going out and basically just buying the whole market. So buying an S&P 500 index fund, or buying a New Zealand 50 index fund, or an ASX 200, or whatever country or stock market you want to invest in, and basically just tracking the returns that that index makes. So I think a lot of people really enjoy picking individual stocks. I certainly do, and I'm reasonably confident that I'll do well over an extended period of time. But I think a lot of people perhaps don't have the mindset to do well with picking individual companies. Maybe they get very emotional when there's big fluctuations up or down, or their stocks move around a lot, that keeps them up at night or whatever it is. So I think a great option for a lot of people is simply to buy the index, to contribute to putting money into the stock market, into the general stock market consistently, and basically just earning market rates of return over a long period of time. Frankly, if you can do that strategy with relatively low costs, you'll probably do better than most individual investors, and you'll certainly do better than most mutual funds, because mutual funds are kind of structurally at a disadvantage. They go out and make their investments. Maybe they do make a market rate of return and get something like 7 or 8 or 9% returns over the long term. Then they go out and charge their clients, a 2% fee plus some extra for performance, and all of a sudden you're back under maybe a 6, or you're back to sort of a 5% return or something like that. And that gap structurally makes mutual funds as a whole quite poor investments relative to just buying the index over a long period of time. So that was my first tip, is just think about index investing. For me personally, I've kind of done that with my KiwiSaver. So if you're not from New Zealand, that's kind of our equivalent of a 401k, like you might have in the US, or a super scheme like you might have in Australia. I've basically gone down the index investing route in my KiwiSaver. So I pick a lot of individual stocks, obviously, with my everyday sort of investing and savings, but I'm kind of hedging that with my index investing in my KiwiSaver, so that, frankly, if I don't do as well as I would hope to have done over the next 20 or 30 years with picking individual companies, I've got that money on the side indexed away that should get a market rate of return over the long term. So my second tip is copycat investing. Now, if you've watched any of my 13F videos on the channel, that is basically what this is all about. And I'm going to reference a study here that went back and looked at what would happen if you had cloned Warren Buffett's investments over the past several decades. What sort of return would you have made if you just basically did whatever Warren Buffett did in his public filings that came out through Berkshire Hathaway? And what that study basically found is that if you had cloned Warren Buffett's investments, even after the 90-day delay that 13F filings have, you would have beaten the market by about 11% a year. And this is through a period of time where the market itself did something like 10 or 12% a year. So here you are, just simply copying exactly what Warren Buffett does, putting no thought into your portfolio other than that, and you would have been doing well north of 20% a year compounded, which just is spectacular rates of return to do it over any sort of sustainable period of time. So that's my second tip, is copycat investing. I use the website Whale Wisdom to do all my 13F cloning, and I'll put up a bit of a list on the screen here of some of my favorite investors to follow, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with from looking at the 13F update videos that we do each quarter. Now, my third tip for becoming a wise investor is a bit of a nostalgic one, because this was the topic of my first ever YouTube video. Please don't go and watch that, but this is what it was about, and that is the rule of 72. Now, the rule of 72 is basically a really simple way to do the maths of compounding in your head. So for whatever reason, the human brain doesn't work particularly well with compounding numbers. It works pretty well with kind of linear growth. So you can look at 5 times 5 equals 25, that sort of stuff, is fairly straightforward to do for most people in their head. But when you look at compounding numbers and kind of exponential growth, for whatever reason, the human brain really struggles with that. So if I were to say, if I have $1,000 and I grow that at 10% a year over the next decade, what do I end up with in 10 years' time? That is a really tricky calculation for most people to do in their head. So that's where the rule of 72 comes in. Basically, the rule of 72 helps you figure out how long it takes something to double, fundamentally. So basically what you do is you grab the number 72. Don't ask me why it's the number 72. It just sort of works. You divide that by your annual rate of return. So let's say you make a 10% return per year. 72 divided by 10 is about 7.2. So that means that if you make a 10% return per year, it's going to take about 7 years for that money to double. So if you make your $1,000 investment, then over the next 7 years, if you're making 10% a year, you're going to have $2,000 after 7 years. It's going to double again in another 7. So after 14 years, you've now got 4,000. 7 years later, you've now got 8,000, and so on and so on. It kind of keeps doubling every 7 years in that scenario. And this works with all sorts of rates of return. So if you make a 15% return per year, 72 divided by 15 is roughly 5. So if you can make 15% a year, you should be doubling every 5 years. If you can make 25% a year, then you should be doubling about every 3 years. So that's a really useful one. I also use it to look at actual company numbers as well. So if a company, for example, has, let's say, doubled their earnings in the last 5 years, that's one double every 5 years. So 72 divided by 5 gets me about 15. So that's telling me that they're growing their earnings at about 15% per year over that 5-year stretch of time in order to double it. So that's the rule of 72. Really, really useful kind of mental hack for figuring out compounding up in your brain. Now, tip number 4 for becoming a wise investor is this idea of the coffee can portfolio. And the coffee can portfolio is basically the idea of buying a handful of really high quality companies, sticking them into a coffee can. I guess you can't do that now that everything's digital, but basically forgetting about those investments and just letting them do their thing over a long period of time. I think one of the things that often holds people back from making really spectacular returns, especially young people who are, used to instant gratification and instant information and all this sort of stuff, which I like to think I can get away from a little bit, but we're all prone to that kind of stuff. I think something that makes those people really struggle is their inability to hold investments over a long period of time. It's easy to look back at something like, say, Apple stock and say, well, if I bought that in 1980 and I put $10,000 into it, I'd be a multi-millionaire today. And that's really easy to say, but much more difficult to do. So that does take some serious holding power, and this idea of the coffee can portfolio and just buying a few high quality companies and forgetting about them, I think is a really useful strategy for a lot of people. So in this book, 100 Baggers, Stocks That Return 100 to 1 by Chris Mayer, which is a great read if you haven't read it before. Basically, Christopher goes through and talks through all of the stocks that over a long period of time went up 100x. He found that during his study from, I think it was 1962 to 2014, there were about 360 odd stocks that went up 100 times. But what he also found is that the average period of time for those stocks to actually go up 100x was over 20 years. It was around 26 years. So if you're wanting to really capture those massive 100 baggers and so on, it does take a lot of willpower to hold on, unless of course you can just forget about them altogether. So if you can use this coffee can strategy and just basically buy the stocks and forget about them, come back in 20 years time and see how they're doing, that can be really, really useful for allowing you to hold on and not make, rash decisions in terms of buying and selling, when really you've got a fundamentally very high quality company that will just continue to grow over a long period of time. Now, the fifth and final tip for becoming a wise investor, which we've kind of touched on right through this video, is something that I refer to as the eighth wonder of the world, which is kind of quoting Einstein, I believe it was. And that's basically the idea of having compounding work on our side. So the idea of being able to take a small amount of money, have it grow and grow and grow and grow and kind of snowball up into something much more substantial. And this is basically the reason why all of us should be investors. It's the idea of, earning $1 today and turning that into much more than $1 in the future, and growing our net worth over time by making intelligent investments and compounding our wealth. Now, I'm not going to talk on that for too much longer, other than to say I think if you haven't already, you should go to some sort of website that has a compound interest calculator. I really like the one on MoneyChimp, so maybe I'll put a screenshot of that up here and I'll leave a link down in the description. But basically, I would urge you, if you haven't already, to go on a compound interest calculator and just play with some numbers. It's really interesting, or I found it basically a game changer personally. When I did this, 3 or 4 years ago and looked at, what would happen to my kind of final number that I end up with if I change some of the variables within this compound interest calculator. So, if you're starting with zero, maybe you've just started working or something like that, stick in $0 as a starting point, and figure out how much you think you can save each year, and then just stick in a market rate of return like 7 or 8% a year. And if you've got a long runway, say 20 or 30 or 40 years left to invest and you're relatively young, you'll find that relatively modest amounts of money going in each year can turn into something very substantial at the end. And if you start to get a bit more aggressive and you're someone like me who basically just tries to save and invest as much as humanly possible, and tries to pursue things like this YouTube channel and ways of trying to make more money to stick into this compounding engine, you can start to get some larger and larger and larger numbers forecast to sort of come out when you reach retirement or whatever your end goal kind of is. So I would definitely urge you to go and check that out if you haven't already. But there you have it. Those are my top 5 tips to become a wise investor. Simple, actionable, hopefully fairly practical tips that most of you can utilize in your own investing. So hope you did enjoy. If you're interested in reading the full article, I'll leave a link down in the description for that. But that's all for me today. So I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please hit like and hit subscribe. You can watch some older videos over there, hit subscribe over there, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.